We had just moved to a new town, looking for a fresh start. The house we found was an amazing deal, almost too good to be true. It had been uninhabited for 2 years, ever since the previous owner, a community businessman named Jonathan Woodrow, was murdered by his wife. She died of an illness shortly after, before she could be prosecuted. The house stood empty, and no one in town wanted to buy it. We saw it as an opportunity, thinking a good paint job and some maintenance would make it new and cozy again. The house was a grand old structure with a lot of character. It had tall windows, a wraparound porch, and a big yard, but it also had an air of neglect. The paint was peeling, the garden was overgrown, and the inside was dusty and stale. We didn't mind. We spent the day cleaning and unpacking, excited to make this place our home. As evening fell, the house seemed to settle around us, the creaks and groans of old wood a comforting backdrop to our chatter. That first night, as we settled into bed, I felt a strange chill. The air seemed heavier, almost oppressive. I brushed it off as nerves and exhaustion. We drifted off to sleep, but I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. It was faint and indistinct, like someone was just out of earshot. I turned on the light, but there was nothing there. Michael assured me it was nothing. The next day, we continued our work on the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In every room, it felt like there were eyes on me. That night, the whispering returned. Louder this time. I could almost make out words, but not quite. It was unsettling, but again, we tried to ignore it. A few days later, strange things started happening. Objects moved on their own. We would leave a room and come back to find things in different places. Doors would open and close by themselves. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the whispering became more frequent. It was as if the house was alive and it didn't want us there. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. I woke Michael, and we both listened in silence. The footsteps stopped outside our bedroom door. The door, which had been closed, creaked open slowly. We stared at it, frozen with fear, but nothing happened. The door just hung open, and the hallway was empty. We tried to carry on as usual, but the atmosphere in the house was getting more oppressive. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. I turned around and saw a shadow pass through the kitchen. I dropped the knife I was holding and ran to find Michael. He was in the living room, staring at the same shadow. It moved quickly, disappearing into the walls. We both stood there, shaken and unsure of what we had just seen. The nights became unbearable. We tried to ignore the whispering, but it was impossible to sleep. One night, I felt something tugging at the blankets. I opened my eyes and saw the figure of a man standing at the foot of our bed. His face was twisted in anger, and his eyes seemed to burn with a cold fire. I screamed, and the figure vanished, leaving us in the dark, trembling with fear. The final straw came during a thunderstorm. The wind howled outside, and lightning flashed, illuminating the house in stark, white light. We were both awakened by the feeling of pressure on our chests. It was as if something was sitting on us, squeezing the air out of our lungs. We couldn't move, couldn't scream. The room was filled with a dark, oppressive presence. Just when we thought we couldn't endure it any longer, a lightning bolt struck close to the house. The power went out, and the house shook. The pressure lifted and we could breathe again. We didn't waste a moment. We grabbed our phones and ran out of the house in our pajamas, not caring about the rain pouring down on us. As we reached the main road, drenched and shivering, a car approached. It was a doctor on his way to an emergency. He stopped and picked us up, seeing the terror on our faces. We told him what happened, and he drove us to the hospital where he worked. We were given blankets and a place to calm down. The staff listened to our story with a mix of disbelief and concern. The next morning, we hired a moving crew to get our things from the house. We couldn't bring ourselves to set foot in there again. The crew reported feeling uneasy, but they didn't experience anything unusual. We packed up and moved to a small apartment in town, far away from that house. Neither of us had been superstitious or believed in ghosts before this experience, but now we had a renewed respect for the things we cannot understand. The house on the outskirts of town remained empty, a silent reminder of the terror we faced. We decided to let go of the past and focus on our future. The experience brought us closer together and made us appreciate the peace and safety of our new home. We never spoke of the house again, but the memory of that frightful night stayed with us, a chilling reminder of the unseen forces that can lurk in the shadows. I had always been fascinated by abandoned places, especially those I had a personal connection to. As a former medical student, I spent countless hours in the old hospital on the outskirts of the city. Years ago, the hospital had been shut down after a new, modern facility was built in the city center, leaving the old building to decay. Now, the hospital stood empty, a shadow of its former self. One day last fall, driven by a mix of nostalgia and curiosity, I decided to return and explore the place where I once trained. A photographer friend of mine agreed to join me, but when we got to the site, he felt too creeped out to go in. He said he would just stay around the car taking pictures from out here. I was surprised, but it was all good. I was not going to let that stop me from going in. The hospital was a giant empty shell, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Weeds and vines crept up the sides of the building, and the front entrance was blocked by debris. I slipped through a gap in the fence and made my way inside. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot. The silence was eerie. It made me think of a sunken ship, forgotten at the bottom of the ocean. The hallways were dark, and the wards were empty, their beds covered in dust and cobwebs. It was hard to believe that this place had once been filled with life and activity. As I walked through the crumbling hallways, I couldn't help but reminisce about the past. I remembered the busy days and nights, the patients and the staff, the echo of hurried footsteps, the beeping of machines, and the murmur of conversations filled my mind. I could almost see the doctors and nurses rushing by, attending to their duties. I even remembered how desperately tired I would get during those 24-hour shifts. My nostalgia was suddenly interrupted by the sound of faint, hurried footsteps. I stopped and listened, but the sound was gone. I continued exploring, making my way to the operating rooms. The surgical lights were still there, covered in dust. The once sterile environment was now a scene of decay and neglect. As I took pictures, I noticed fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. They were not mine. Someone had been here recently, and I realized they might still be here. Cautiously, I continued down the hallway of the ward, and that's when I caught a glimpse of a room that was clearly occupied. Part of me wanted to run screaming, but another part of me was drawn to the scene like a magnet, and I found myself peeking into the room. A made bed, a TV, a mini fridge plugged into the wall, a small garbage can half filled. Someone had been living here. Who would live in a place like this, and why? I suddenly felt completely exposed. The thought of someone hiding in the shadows, watching me, made me uneasy. As I carefully made my down the rest of the ward towards the exit, I passed a dimly lit room and saw a group of squatters. They were huddled together, their faces hidden in the shadows. They were led by a volatile and paranoid man. He spotted me and immediately became aggressive, shouting and accusing me of trying to take their refuge. His eyes were wild, and his voice echoed through the empty hospital. He lunged at me with a broken piece of metal, and I barely managed to dodge his attack. The other squatters looked on, unsure of what to do. I knew I had to get out of there. I ran, through corridor after corridor and then down a bunch of stairs. The hospital was a maze of dark hallways and decrepit stairwells. I could hear the man chasing me, his heavy breathing and angry shouts getting closer, then further, then close, then further. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to find a way out. The hallways twisted and turned, each one looking the same. I stumbled over debris, barely catching myself before falling. The man's footsteps were getting louder, and I knew I couldn't slow down. I turned a corner and nearly ran into a pile of old, rusted machinery. I ducked behind it, trying to catch my breath. The man ran past, not noticing me. I stayed hidden, waiting for the sound of his footsteps to fade. All I kept thinking is that I had to get out of there. I peeked out from behind the machinery, checking to see if the coast was clear. The silence was deafening. I made my way to a nearby staircase, hoping it would lead me to an exit. The steps creaked under my weight, and I winced at the noise. I climbed quickly, my legs burning with the effort. At the top, I found another hallway. This one darker and more decrepit than the last. As I walked, I noticed more signs of someone living here. Empty cans, torn clothes, and even a broken radio. How many of them were there? Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see the man at the other end of the hallway, his eyes fixed on me. He started running towards me, his pipe raised. I bolted. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, each step feeling heavier than the last. I spotted a door up ahead and sprinted towards it. I threw it open and ran inside, slamming it shut behind me. I looked around and realized I was in an office. Desks and chairs were scattered around, covered in dust. I locked the door and moved a heavy cabinet in front of it, hoping it would buy me some time. I searched the room for another way out. In the corner, I found a small window, partially broken. It was my only chance. I climbed onto a desk and squeezed through the window. I felt a sharp pain in my leg as I fell to the ground outside, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I limped away from the factory, hearing the man's screams fade into the distance. I made it to the edge of the factory and called my friend to drive over and get me. I needed to get to a hospital right away, a functioning hospital. I made it to the edge of the factory grounds and called my friend to drive over and get me. My leg throbbed with pain, and I knew I needed to get to a hospital right away, a functioning hospital. When my friend arrived, he looked worried but didn't ask any questions. He helped me into the car, and we drove in silence. I told the emergency personnel that I had suffered a bad fall while exploring. They examined my leg and confirmed it was broken. As they set it and put on a cast, I couldn't help but think about the men living in the old hospital. I knew I should report them, but I just wanted to forget the whole thing. My friend stayed with me through the ordeal, understanding my desire to leave the past behind. On the way back home, I realized how dangerous my urban exploring hobby had become. The experience was a wake-up call, showing me that I had been holding on to memories from my time at the old hospital for too long. Over the next few weeks, as my leg healed, I made a conscious effort to move on. I stopped visiting old abandoned places and focused on building a future. Surprisingly, I met someone special not long after. We started dating, and I found myself falling in love. It was truly interesting how life worked. That terrifying experience in the old hospital gave me the push I needed to let go of the past and embrace the future. I realized that holding on to memories was holding me back, and it was time to grow up and move forward. I had always been drawn to places with dark histories. As a documentary filmmaker, uncovering the secrets of forgotten places was my passion. So when I heard about the abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of a decaying suburb, I knew I had to film it. The park had been closed for over 30 years, following a series of tragic accidents that had claimed several lives. I wanted to document its eerie beauty and the tragic stories that had been left behind. It was a cloudy Thursday afternoon when my small crew and I arrived at the park. The entrance was a rusted iron gate, partially covered in ivy and barely hanging onto its hinges. The once bright sign that welcomed visitors was now faded and broken, with letters missing or hanging askew. The park stood as a ghost town of rusting rides and overgrown pathways. Weeds had taken over, and the colors of the attractions had faded into dull, peeling paint. As we walked through the gate, the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional creak of metal in the wind. It was hard to believe that this place had once been filled with laughter and joy. Now it was a shadow of its former self, a place where time had stood still. The first thing we saw was the Ferris wheel. It towered over the park, its seats rusted and hanging at odd angles. The wheel creaked in the wind, turning ever so slightly as if moved by some unseen force. We stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The park felt like a forgotten dream, a place where happy memories had turned into nightmares that would linger here for years. We split up to cover more ground, each of us equipped with a walkie-talkie to stay in touch. I headed towards the old roller coaster, its twisted tracks looming like a skeletal monster against the darkening sky. The cars were still on the tracks, frozen in place, as if waiting for passengers that would never come. The wood was rotten, and the metal was covered in rust. I could almost hear the screams of excitement and fear from long ago. As I walked, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped and turned, but there was no one there. I assumed the sinister atmosphere was getting to me, and that I imagined the sound. Near the roller coaster, I found a maintenance shed. The door was slightly open, and I decided to take a look inside. The shed was filled with rusty tools and broken parts. On a dusty table, I noticed a pile of scribbled notes and old photographs of the park in its heyday. The photos showed smiling families and children enjoying the rides. It was hard to reconcile those happy images with the decay and silence around me. As I sifted through the notes, I found a disturbing image: a group of people in masks standing in front of the carousel. They weren't part of the park's staff. Their eyes seemed to stare straight through the photo, and for a moment, I felt a chill run through. I radioed one of my crew members, Sam, to share my find. His voice crackled with excitement as he said he had discovered a hidden entrance to an underground maintenance tunnel near the bumper cars. I decided to join him, intrigued by the possibility of more secrets. As I approached the bumper cars, the sky grew darker and the shadows deepened. The hidden entrance was a small, rusted door, again partially covered by overgrown ivy. I pulled it open and descended into the darkness, using my flashlight to light the way. The tunnel was damp and smelled of mold. The walls were lined with pipes and wires, and the floor was uneven, with puddles of stagnant water. As I moved deeper, I found signs that someone had been living there. Canned food, a sleeping bag, and more scribbled notes. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me. I turned, and there stood a masked man, a knife glinting in his hand. The man swung his blade at me, and I barely dodged it. I screamed into my radio, "Help! Someone help me!" My voice echoed in the dark tunnel, but there was no answer. The masked maniac blocked the entrance, forcing me to run in the other direction. The tunnel was long and dark. At times, the smell was horrendous, like rotting food and damp earth, but I pushed on, making sure to stay ahead of the threatening footsteps following me. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, my flashlight beam shaking wildly. Finally, I reached the other end of the tunnel. I had two choices: run into the open space ahead where he would easily see me, or hide in the remains of the haunted mansion to the left of the tunnel exit. I decided to hide. I dashed into the haunted mansion and hid behind a ghostly figure prop. I pulled an old dusty costume over myself to hide better. I held my breath, praying it would work. The masked guy with the knife ran straight past the haunted mansion. He stopped, confused, and turned around a couple of times looking for me. The dustiness of the outfit made me sneeze. His head snapped toward the sound, and he located me. I jumped down and sprinted toward the park exit. He quickly caught up, tackling me to the ground. "It's over," he said, his voice cold and menacing. Just then, my radio crackled. One of my crew members shouted, "The police are here. We're coming." The man's eyes widened in fear. He disappeared in a flash, clearly not wanting to be found by the police. I got up and ran to my crew, who were close enough to see everything. Turns out the police had not yet arrived. That was just something Joel, my crew member, said to get the man off me. It worked. He saved my life. We decided to leave immediately. The park's eerie atmosphere was too much to handle now. We grabbed our equipment quickly, my eyes darting around, still scared the man might return. The rusty rides and overgrown paths, which had seemed mysterious and intriguing before, now looked menacing and dangerous. I couldn't believe how close I had come to getting seriously hurt. Or worse. As we drove away, I thought about how truly fascinating the concept was. This forgotten relic of the past, left to rust and fade and take up dead space due to the demise of the town and legal battles of ownership and liability that were never settled. My team and I, however, were cured of the urge to be the ones to tell the story. When we got back to our hotel, we called the police and told them everything. They promised to investigate, but I doubted they would find the man. He had vanished so quickly, like a ghost. The next few days were tough. I couldn't stop thinking about the masked man. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his shadowy figure and the glint of his knife. The experience left me deeply shaken. I couldn't sleep well. Every noise made me jump, and I kept checking the locks on the doors and windows. My documentary took on a new focus. Instead of just the history of the amusement park, I decided to highlight the dangers of exploring abandoned places. I wanted to warn others about what could happen. The abandoned amusement park had given me a story I would never forget, a story that changed me forever. I had always been fascinated by abandoned places, their silence, and the stories they held. There was something about the way time stood still in those forgotten buildings that drew me in. Every broken window and peeling wall seemed to whisper secrets from the past. So when I heard about the old elementary school on the outskirts of my hometown, I knew I had to visit it. The school had been empty for over 20 years, ever since a fire had gutted the main building. Some said it was haunted, but I didn't believe in ghosts. I just wanted to capture the eerie beauty of the forgotten place for my new book. As a 27-year-old writer, I was always on the lookout for unique and intriguing settings to inspire my stories. The day I decided to visit the school was overcast, with dark clouds hanging low in the sky. It felt fitting, like the weather was adding to the mystery of the old building. I parked my car on the side of the road and walked the rest of the way. The school stood alone, surrounded by overgrown grass and weeds that reached up to my knees. It was clear that no one had taken care of the place for a very long time. As I approached the school, I could see that its windows were broken, and the paint was peeling off the walls in large, jagged chunks. The building looked tired, as if it was sighing under the weight of its own history. The playground equipment was rusty, and the swings creaked in the wind, making a haunting, almost musical sound. The whole scene was both sad and beautiful, like a forgotten memory brought back to life. I took a deep breath and stepped through the broken gate. The crunch of gravel under my feet echoed in the stillness. I could almost hear the laughter of children playing and the ringing of the school bell. But those sounds were long gone. Now there was only silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. The front door of the school was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. I pushed it open, and it creaked loudly, breaking the silence. Inside, the smell of mildew and decay hit me, making me wrinkle my nose. The halls were dark, lit only by the occasional shaft of light from the broken windows. My footsteps echoed, making me feel uneasy, as if I was intruding on a place I didn't belong. The first thing I noticed was the graffiti on the walls. Bright colors and bold lines clashed with the otherwise dull and dusty interior. It was a sign that someone had been here, someone who didn't care about the history of the place. I spotted discarded beer cans and fast food wrappers on the floor, adding to the sense of recent human activity. It made me feel a little on edge, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was here to explore and document, not to be scared away by a few careless vandals. I made my way to the old classrooms, each one filled with overturned desks and scattered books. It was like the students had just gotten up and left one day, leaving everything behind. In one corner of a classroom, I saw a makeshift bed made of old blankets and pillows. Someone had been living here. As I felt my anxiety mounting, I reminded myself that it was probably just a homeless person looking for shelter. Then, I heard it. Faint whispers, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I spun around quickly, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It must have been the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and it was getting harder to ignore. I pressed on, determined to finish what I had started. I reached the gym, where I found old sports equipment scattered around. There was a large mural of the school mascot on the wall, faded and cracked with age. The room was dark, except for a single beam of light, again from a broken window, cutting through the darkness like a spotlight. I was about to leave when I heard the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I froze. The noise was slow and deliberate, like someone moving a heavy object. I strained to listen, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. All I could hear was my own breathing, ragged and shallow. Every instinct was telling me to get out of there, but my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I waited, half expecting the noise to start again. But the silence remained, thick and suffocating. I knew I had to leave, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. I forced myself to move, taking slow, cautious steps towards the door. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. I reached the door and slipped out into the hallway, feeling a little safer with the gym behind me. I decided to get out of there and started heading back to the entrance. As I walked down the hallway, I heard a door creak open behind me. I turned around slowly. At the end of the hall, a shadowy figure stood, partially hidden. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me. The figure started walking towards me, slowly at first, then faster. I turned and ran. Not feeling unsure I could outrun the figure all the way back to the entrance, I ducked into a classroom and hid behind a desk, trying to catch my breath. The door to the classroom creaked open, and the figure entered, their heavy breathing filling the silence. I crouched lower, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could see their feet as they walked past me, slow and deliberate. They stopped right next to the desk, standing still as if sensing my presence. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The tension was unbearable, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the figure moved on, their footsteps fading as they left the room. I quietly crawled to the door and peeked out. The figure was disappearing around a corner, their back turned to me. I took the chance and bolted for the exit, my feet barely touching the ground. As I ran, I heard footsteps behind me again, faster and closer this time. Suddenly, a hand grazes my shoulder. I screamed, pushing myself to run faster, my lungs burning with the effort. I reached the main entrance, but the door was stuck. I yanked on it with all my strength, desperation fueling my efforts. Just as the figure lunged at me, the door gave way, and I stumbled outside, falling to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, looking back to see the figure standing in the doorway, their face obscured by shadows. They didn't follow me outside, just watched as I ran to my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I started the car and drove away, my heart still pounding harder than I could handle. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I called the police and told them about the figure in the school. They said they would check it out, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. The experience left me deeply shaken. I couldn't sleep for weeks, haunted by the memory of that shadowy figure. I abandoned my book project and focused on writing safer, less adventurous stories. The thought of exploring another abandoned place filled me with dread. I learned that some places are better left forgotten, their stories untold. My love for urban exploration was replaced with a newfound respect for the unknown. I realized that not all stories need to be uncovered, and sometimes it's better to leave the past buried.